Black Belt asked a black single dad to spar. For fun. What happened next left everyone speechless. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Marcus Williams pushed his mop across the worn wooden floors of Dragon's Den Martial Arts Academy. It was 11:47 p.m., and the dojo had been empty for nearly 2 hours. The familiar scent of sweat, rubber mats, and cleaning solution filled the air, a combination that had become as routine to him as breathing. Most people would find this work mind-numbing. The same motions, night after night. Sweep the mats. Mop the floors. Empty the trash bins overflowing with energy bar wrappers and crumpled water bottles. Fix whatever was broken, and in a place where people threw each other around for sport, something was always broken. But Marcus found peace in the routine. There was something meditative about the repetitive movements, the solitude, the way his hands moved automatically while his mind wandered to other things. Like how he was going to help Jaden with his math homework tomorrow, or whether he'd saved enough to finally get the boy those new sneakers he'd been eyeing for months. Tonight, the leaky faucet in the men's locker room had been acting up again. Marcus had spent the better part of an hour wrestling with corroded pipes and rusty fixtures, his janitor's uniform getting progressively more stained with each twist of his wrench. But he'd fixed it, he always did. Sensei Williams, no relation, despite sharing the last name, had mentioned weeks ago that they need to call a plumber, but Marcus had quietly taken care of it instead. No need to add to the dojo's expenses when he could handle it himself. As he worked, Marcus caught glimpses of his reflection in the mirrored walls that lined the training area. 42 years old, with graying temples that seemed to have appeared overnight, and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many late nights and early mornings. He wasn't the same man he used to be, physically or otherwise. His shoulders were broader now from years of manual labor, his hands calloused from handling cleaning equipment and maintenance tools rather than other things. The younger students sometimes lingered after class, and Marcus had grown fond of their innocent chatter. There was Tommy, the 8-year-old white belt who always forgot his water bottle and had to come back for it, giving Marcus someone to talk to during those quiet evening hours. And Sarah, the teenage girl who was working toward her brown belt and often stayed late to practice her forms, sometimes asking Marcus if he'd seen her keys or her phone. "Mr. Marcus!" Tommy had called out just yesterday evening, running back into the dojo with his trademark gap-toothed grin. "I forgot my water bottle again." "Again?" Marcus had chuckled, pausing in his sweeping to help the boy look. "That's the 3rd time this week, little man. Your mom's gonna think I'm keeping you hostage in here. She says you're the nicest janitor ever." Tommy had replied with the casual honesty that only children possess. "She says most janitors just tell us to hurry up and leave, but you actually help us find our stuff." Marcus had smiled at that, though something in his chest had tightened. Just a janitor. That's what he was to everyone here, the quiet, helpful guy who cleaned up after everyone else, who fixed what was broken, who existed in the background of other people's lives. But he couldn't complain. The job paid decent money for night work, and the hours meant he could be home during the day when Jaden got back from school. Single parenting wasn't easy, especially when you were doing it on a janitor's salary, but they were managing. More than managing, they were building something together, just the two of them. Jaden knew, of course. Not everything, but enough. The boy had seen the old trophies tucked away in the back of Marcus's closet, the faded photographs that Marcus thought he'd hidden well enough. He'd asked questions with the persistence that only a 10-year-old could muster. "Dad, who's that in the picture with the gold medal? Dad, why do you know so much about fighting if you're just a janitor? Dad, Tommy's mom asked if you ever trained here. I told her I didn't know. Do you?" Marcus had deflected, changed the subject, redirected Jaden's curiosity toward homework or dinner or whatever was on TV. The boy was smart, too smart sometimes, but he'd stopped pressing. For now. The truth was complicated. The truth was heavy. The truth was something Marcus had walked away from 12 years ago, and he never looked back. Not really. Not until he started working here, surrounded by the sounds and smells and energy of a world he'd once known intimately. As he finished mopping the main training area, Marcus allowed himself a moment to look around. The walls were covered with photographs of tournament winners, local champions, students who'd gone on to compete at state and national levels. In the center, behind glass, hung a collection of medals and trophies from various competitions. It was an impressive display, the kind that inspired young students to dream bigger. His eyes lingered on one particular section of the wall, where the photos were older, the colors slightly faded. There were fighters he recognized, faces that brought back memories he'd spent years trying to forget. Good memories, mostly, but tied to a life that no longer existed. The front door chimed softly as someone entered. Marcus looked up, surprised. It was nearly midnight, well past closing time. "Hello?" he called out, setting his mop aside. "Just me, Mr. Williams," came a familiar voice from the entrance. Jaden appeared, still in his pajamas with a jacket thrown over them and sneakers on his feet. "Mom next door said she saw the lights on and figured you were still working." Marcus felt a familiar mix of warmth and concern. Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor, had been watching Jaden since he was small, but the boy had a habit of walking over to the dojo when he couldn't sleep. "You're supposed to be in bed, Jay," Marcus said, but his tone was gentle. "It's a school night." "I know, Jaden looked around the empty dojo with wide eyes, the same expression he'd worn since he was little whenever he visited his father's workplace. "I like it here. It's cool seeing where you work." Marcus watched his son take in the training equipment, the mirrored walls, the photographs of fighters frozen in moments of victory. There was something in the boy's expression, curiosity, maybe, or longing. Jaden had never shown much interest in martial arts, preferring basketball and video games, but lately, Marcus had caught him watching YouTube videos of famous fighters, asking seemingly casual questions about techniques and training methods. "Can I wait here while you finish?" Jaden asked, settling onto one of the benches along the wall. "I promise I won't touch anything." Marcus nodded, returning to his work. But he was more aware now of how he moved, how he carried himself. Jaden was watching. He could feel those young eyes tracking his every movement. Did the boy see what others missed? Did he notice the way his father's footwork remained precise even while pushing a mop, the way his balance never wavered, the unconscious habits that 12 years away from competition hadn't quite erased? The silence stretched between them, comfortable but loaded with unspoken questions. Marcus finished his cleaning routine, checked the locks on the equipment cabinets, and gathered his supplies. In a few minutes, they'd walk home together through the quiet streets, and Jaden would go back to bed, and tomorrow would bring another day of the same routine. But tonight felt different somehow. Tonight, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, that the careful balance he'd maintained between his past and present was becoming harder to sustain. Maybe it was the way Jaden had been looking at him lately, with questions in his eyes that were growing harder to deflect. Maybe it was the constant reminder of what he used to be, working night after night in a place that echoed with the sounds of his former life. Or maybe it was simply time catching up with him, time demanding answers he wasn't sure he was ready to give. "Ready to head home?" Marcus asked, shouldering his bag of cleaning supplies. Jaden nodded, but he took one last look around the dojo before following his father toward the exit. In that glance, Marcus saw something that made his chest tight with emotion, pride, curiosity, and something that looked suspiciously like hope. As they walked home under the streetlights, neither father nor son spoke about what hung unspoken between them. But both were thinking about it, carrying questions that would soon demand answers, whether Marcus was ready or not. Damian Cross had always prided himself on reading people. It was a skill that had served him well both inside and outside the dojo, the ability to size up an opponent in seconds, to spot weaknesses in their stance, to predict their next move before they even knew they were going to make it. At 28, he was Dragon's Den's undisputed star. His second-degree black belt hung prominently in the display case, surrounded by tournament photos and gleaming trophies. Students looked up to him, parents praised him to Sensei Williams, and younger black belts sought his approval like it was gold. Damian had earned every bit of that respect through years of disciplined training, countless hours of perfecting his technique, and an almost supernatural ability to analyze movement patterns. Which was exactly why Marcus Williams, the quiet night janitor, had been bothering him for weeks. It started small. Just little things that caught Damien's eye during the rare occasions when their schedules overlapped. Sometimes Damien would stay late to work on his forms or help close up the dojo, and he'd see Marcus beginning his nightly routine. Most people moved like, well, most people, awkward, unbalanced, unconscious of their own bodies. But Marcus moved differently. The first time Damien noticed it, Marcus was reaching up to change a light bulb in one of the overhead fixtures. Instead of using a ladder like any normal person would, he'd simply stepped onto a nearby bench, shifted his weight, and flowed upward in one smooth motion. His balance was perfect, his feet positioned just so, his center of gravity never wavering. It was the kind of movement that took years to develop, the kind that became second nature only through extensive martial arts training. But that could have been coincidence. Maybe Marcus had done some boxing in his youth, or played sports in high school. Lots of people had some athletic background. Then Damien started watching more carefully. The way Marcus swept the mats wasn't random. There was a pattern to it, an efficiency that suggested someone who understood angles and leverage. When he carried heavy equipment, he distributed the weight perfectly, never straining, never off balance. And his footwork, his footwork, was unconsciously precise, each step placed with the kind of intentional spacing that marked a trained fighter. "You notice anything weird about the janitor?" Damien had asked his training partner Kyle about a week ago. Kyle had shrugged. "Marcus? He seems cool. Fixed the broken mirror in the locker room without even being asked." "Why?" "I don't know, man. Something about the way he moves. He's just doing his job, Damien. Not everyone's a secret ninja." But Damien couldn't let it go. It was like having an itch he couldn't scratch, a puzzle with pieces that almost fit but not quite. Every interaction with Marcus only deepened the mystery. Last Tuesday, Damien had been practicing his spinning back kick when he'd accidentally sent a heavy bag swinging wildly toward the wall. Without thinking, Marcus had stepped in and caught it, not grabbed it awkwardly like most people would, but actually absorbed its momentum with perfect timing and positioning. The movement was so smooth, so natural, that it had to be instinctive. "Nice reflexes," Damien had said, testing the waters. Marcus had just smiled and shrugged. "Quick hands come in handy in this job." But Damien had seen those hands, seen how they moved. Those weren't janitor's reflexes. Those were fighter's reflexes. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, Damien had arrived early for the advanced class and found Marcus already working, organizing equipment in the storage room. What caught Damien's attention wasn't what Marcus was doing, but how he was doing it, lifting and stacking heavy training pads with the precise body mechanics of someone who understood leverage and force distribution at a deep, fundamental level. "Evening, Marcus," Damien said, leaning against the doorframe. "Oh, hey there, Damien." Marcus looked up with that same friendly but distant smile he always wore. "You're early tonight." "Yeah, wanted to get some extra practice in before class." Damien watched as Marcus effortlessly hoisted a bag of boxing gloves that most people would struggle with. "You know, I've been thinking, you're here all the time, around all this equipment. You ever get curious about trying it out?" Marcus paused for just a split second, so briefly that most people wouldn't have caught it. But Damien caught everything. "Not really my thing," Marcus replied. "I'm more of a behind-the-scenes guy these days." "These days?" Damien pounced on the phrase. "What did you used to be into?" Another pause. "Oh, you know. Little bit of everything when I was younger. Basketball, football. Nothing serious." It was a deflection, and they both knew it. Damien felt his curiosity spike even higher. "Come on, man. I see how you move. You've got training. What's your background?" "Just good genes, I guess." Marcus went back to organizing equipment, but there was something in his posture now, a slight tension that hadn't been there before. Damien made a decision. It was impulsive, maybe even reckless, but he'd been wondering about this for too long. "You know what?" he said, his voice taking on the casual tone he used when he was about to do something that sounded reasonable but absolutely wasn't. "You should hop in the ring with me sometime. Just for fun. I bet you'd be better than you think." Marcus stopped what he was doing. Really stopped, going completely still in a way that sent alerts through every one of Damien's finely tuned instincts. "I don't think that's a good idea," Marcus said carefully. "Why not? We're about the same size, and I promise I'll go easy on you." Damien grinned, but there was genuine curiosity burning behind his eyes. "Come on, when's the last time you had some fun? Just a friendly spar. I appreciate the offer, but..." "Marcus." Damien's voice grew more serious. "I've been watching you for weeks. You move like someone with serious training. I'm not trying to embarrass you or prove anything. I'm genuinely curious about your background." For a long moment, Marcus just looked at him. There was something calculating in that gaze, something that made Damien's fighter instincts prickle with anticipation. "Maybe another time," Marcus finally said. But as he spoke, Damien caught something else, a slight shift in Marcus's stance, a micro-adjustment that spoke of someone who was unconsciously preparing for conflict. It was subtle, nearly invisible, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. Damien's grin widened. Whatever Marcus's story was, it was bigger than he'd imagined. 3 days passed before Damien brought it up again. Marcus had hoped the younger man would forget about his casual challenge, that whatever curiosity had been sparked would fade with time. But Damien wasn't the type to let things go. Marcus had learned that much from watching him teach the advanced students. When Damien latched onto something, he pursued it with the same relentless focus that had earned him his reputation. It was Thursday evening, and the dojo was buzzing with post-class energy. The adult sparring session had just ended, and several students were lingering, discussing techniques and comparing notes. Marcus was beginning his usual routine, but tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, conversations that seemed to pause when he walked by, glances that followed his movements. "Marcus!" Damien's voice cut through the ambient chatter. "Perfect timing, man." Marcus looked up from where he'd been folding training mats to see Damien approaching with that same confident stride, still wearing his GI from class. Behind him, several other students had stopped their conversations and were watching with obvious interest. "Evening, Damien," Marcus replied carefully, sensing that whatever was coming, he wouldn't like it. "So I was just telling everyone about our conversation the other day," Damien said, his voice carrying just enough volume to include the nearby listeners. "About you hopping in for a friendly spar. What do you say? We've got some time, everyone's already warmed up." Marcus felt the weight of multiple pairs of eyes on him. Kyle, the brown belt who assisted with classes. Sarah, the teenage girl who'd earned her brown belt the month before. Even Tommy, who was supposed to have left with his mother but had apparently convinced her to let him stay and watch. "I told you, that's not really my thing," Marcus said, but his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. "Come on, Dad!" The voice came from the entrance, and Marcus's heart sank. Jaden stood in the doorway, still in his school clothes, backpack slung over one shoulder. He must have walked over from Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment, probably drawn by the unusual amount of activity he could see through the front windows. "Jaden, you shouldn't be here," Marcus started, but his son was already walking toward the group, his eyes bright with excitement. "This is your son?" Damien asked, and Marcus caught the genuine warmth in his voice. For all his intensity about martial arts, Damien had always been good with the younger students. "Yeah, this is Jaden," Marcus said reluctantly. "Cool. Your dad's got some serious skills, kid. We were just trying to convince him to show us what he can do." Jaden's eyes widened as he looked between his father and Damien. "Dad's really good at fighting?" "Well, that's what we're trying to find out," Damien said with a grin. Marcus felt trapped. Not by Damien's challenge, but by the look on his son's face, pure, undiluted excitement mixed with curiosity. How long had it been since Jaden had looked at him like that? How long since his father had been something more than just the guy who worked nights to pay the bills? "I don't have the right clothes," Marcus said, grasping for excuses. I'm in my work uniform. That's fine, said Kyle. I've got an extra GI in my bag if you want. And I'm probably too old for this stuff. My back's been finishing me lately. Age is just a number, man, Damien replied smoothly. Besides, we're just playing around. Nothing serious. The small crowd was growing. Word had apparently spread that something interesting was happening, and more students were filtering back in from the parking lot. Marcus recognized several faces. Parents who'd come to pick up their kids and decided to stay, advanced students who'd been hanging around after class. But it was Jaden's face that broke his resolve. The boy was practically vibrating with anticipation, his usual reserved demeanor replaced by pure excitement. When was the last time Marcus had given his son something to be proud of? When was the last time he'd been more than just the reliable, boring dad who made sure homework got done and bills got paid? Please, Dad, Jaden said quietly, and there was something in his voice that cut straight to Marcus's heart. Marcus looked around at the expectant faces, felt the weight of a decision that seemed much bigger than a simple sparring match. He thought about the trophies hidden in his closet, the photographs he'd never shown his son, the part of himself he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it had never existed. If we're going to do this, he heard himself saying, I don't want any protective gear. The request drew surprised looks from several of the students. Damien raised an eyebrow. No gear? Marcus, that's not really. If it's just for fun, let's keep it natural. Marcus continued, his voice growing steadier with each word. No headgear, no padding. Just you and me. Something shifted in the room's energy. The casual, friendly atmosphere took on a different quality, more focused, more serious. Damien's expression changed too, the easy confidence replaced by something sharper, more analytical. You sure about that? Damien asked. I'm sure. There was a moment of silence as Damien processed this. Marcus could practically see the wheels turning in the younger man's head, recalculating whatever assumptions he'd made. All right, Damien said finally, and there was a new note of respect in his voice. No gear it is. As the crowd formed a loose circle around the main training area, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the mirrored wall. For just a moment, the tired janitor in the stained uniform disappeared, replaced by someone else, someone he hadn't seen in over a decade. Jaden found a spot on one of the benches, his eyes never leaving his father. The boy was practically glowing with excitement, and Marcus felt something awakening in his chest, not just the old competitive fire, but something deeper. Pride, maybe? Or purpose. You ready for this? Damien asked, beginning to stretch. Marcus nodded, surprised to find that he actually was. Whatever happened next, whatever this revealed about who he used to be, it was time. His son deserved to know. Maybe Marcus deserved to remember. Let's do this, he said quietly. But as he began his own warm-up routine, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to cross a line he'd spent 12 years carefully avoiding. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The question was he ready for what lay on the other side? The dojo had transformed. What had started as a casual after-class gathering had evolved into something that felt almost ceremonial. Students sat cross-legged around the perimeter of the main training area, their conversations reduced to hushed whispers. Even Sensei Williams had emerged from his office, drawn by the unusual commotion, and now stood with his arms crossed, watching with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for tournament preparations. Marcus had changed into Kyle's spare GI, though it was slightly too small across the shoulders and short at the wrists. The white fabric felt strange against his skin. It had been so long since he'd worn anything like it. But as he tied the belt around his waist, muscle memory kicked in, and his fingers moved through the familiar motions without conscious thought. Damien stood across from him, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet, his usual pre-sparring routine. But there was something different in his demeanor now. The casual confidence had been replaced by genuine focus, and Marcus could see him running calculations, trying to piece together the puzzle of who he was about to face. All right, everyone, Sensei Williams called out. Keep it controlled. This is still just a friendly demonstration. But the energy in the room suggested otherwise. There was an electricity, an anticipation that came from the collective sense that they were about to witness something significant. Jaden sat in the front row, his hands gripping the edge of the bench, eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was uncharted territory for both father and son. Jaden had never seen his dad do anything more physical than fix a leaky faucet or carry groceries. "You ready?" Damien asked, settling into his fighting stance. A textbook position, balanced and prepared for multiple angles of attack. Marcus nodded, but didn't immediately assume any recognizable stance. Instead, he simply stood there, relaxed, hands at his sides, looking almost casual. To most observers, he appeared completely unprepared. But to the more experienced fighters in the room, there was something unsettling about his stillness, the kind of calm that suggested coiled energy rather than inactivity. "Begin when ready," Sensei Williams announced. Damien started slowly, as promised. He threw a gentle jab toward Marcus's midsection, not meant to hurt, just to test reactions, to see how his opponent would respond to pressure. Marcus moved. It wasn't dramatic. In fact, to most of the watching students, it barely looked like movement at all. He shifted his weight slightly, turned his torso maybe 2 inches, and Damien's jab passed harmlessly by his ribs. No blocking, no dramatic evasion, just the absolute minimum movement necessary to avoid contact. Damien threw another testing strike, this time a light hook toward Marcus's shoulder. Again, Marcus seemed to barely move, but the punch found only empty air. It was as if he'd known exactly where Damien's fist would be before Damien himself had decided. "Whoa!" someone whispered from the crowd. Encouraged, Damien picked up the pace. He launched a series of light combinations, jab, cross, hook, each technique executed with the precision that had earned him his reputation. But none of them landed. Marcus flowed around them like water, each evasion so economical, so perfectly timed, that it looked effortless. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Even the less experienced students could see that something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't luck or coincidence. This was skill at a level most of them had never witnessed. Sarah leaned forward on her bench. "How is he doing that?" Kyle shook his head in amazement. "It's like he's reading Damien's mind." But it wasn't mind reading. Marcus was reading Damien's body, the micro-adjustments in his stance that telegraphed where the next attack would come from, the slight shift in his shoulders that indicated a hook was coming, the way his weight distribution changed before a kick. It was pattern recognition developed over thousands of hours of training, honed to an almost supernatural level of precision. Damien stepped back, breathing slightly harder than he should have been for such a light exchange. He was starting to realize that he wasn't sparring with a curious amateur. He was being systematically analyzed by someone who operated on a completely different level. "Your turn," Damien said, trying to maintain his composure. Marcus shook his head slightly. "I'm good just watching." But as he spoke, he took a half step forward, barely perceptible, but it caused Damien to unconsciously adjust his stance. Then Marcus shifted his weight, and Damien's hands came up defensively. Marcus wasn't attacking, wasn't even threatening to attack, but somehow his mere presence was controlling Damien's reactions. Frustrated, Damien decided to increase the intensity. He launched a more serious combination, a feint followed by a spinning back fist that should have caught Marcus off guard. Marcus saw it coming from 3 moves away. As Damien committed to the spin, Marcus stepped in at an angle that most fighters wouldn't even consider. He moved with a fluidity that seemed to slow time, positioning himself in the one spot where Damien's technique couldn't reach him while simultaneously setting up a counter that never came. Instead, Marcus simply placed his hand on Damien's shoulder as the younger man completed his spin, a gentle touch that somehow completely disrupted Damien's balance and left him stumbling slightly as he tried to recover. The dojo fell completely silent. Damien straightened up, his eyes wide with recognition. That move, that positioning, that timing, that impossible ability to be exactly where he needed to be, it was beyond advanced. It was masterful. "Who are you?" Damien whispered, but his voice carried in the silence. Marcus met his gaze with those calm, unreadable eyes. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually answer. But then he glanced toward Jaden, saw his son's amazed expression, and something in his face shuddered closed again. "Just a janitor," he said quietly. But everyone in that room, from Sensei Williams to little Tommy, knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Whatever Marcus Williams was hiding, it was bigger than any of them had imagined. Damien stepped back, circling slowly around Marcus, his mind racing. Everything he thought he knew about fighting, about reading opponents, about his own abilities, it was all being challenged by a man in an ill-fitting GI who moved like smoke and anticipated attacks that hadn't even been fully formed yet. The crowd sensed the shift in energy. What had started as casual curiosity had become something much more intense. Sensei Williams moved closer to the edge of the training area, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. He'd been teaching martial arts for over 30 years, and he'd seen gifted fighters before, but this was different. This was beyond gift, this was mastery. "Come on, Damien!" called out one of the brown belts. "Show him what you've got!" But Damien wasn't sure he wanted to anymore. Every instinct he developed as a fighter was screaming warnings at him. Marcus wasn't just good, he was operating on a level that Damien was beginning to realize he might not even be able to comprehend, let alone match. Still, pride and curiosity warred within him. He'd issued this challenge, and backing down now wasn't an option. Not in front of his students, not in front of Sensei Williams, and definitely not in front of Marcus's son, who was watching every moment with wide-eyed fascination. "All right," Damien muttered to himself, settling into a more serious fighting stance. "Let's see how you handle this." He began to circle more aggressively, throwing feints and testing strikes, trying to create openings. But Marcus continued to flow around his attacks with that same eerie precision, never seeming hurried, never appearing to exert any real effort. It was as if Damien was fighting someone who could see 3 seconds into the future. Frustration began to creep in. Damien was used to being the best fighter in the room, used to being the one who impressed others with his skill and technique. But here, in front of everyone who looked up to him, he was being made to look amateur by a man who claimed to be just a janitor. The frustration crystallized into determination. If Marcus wanted to play defensive, if he wanted to make Damien look bad with his evasions and subtle counters, then it was time to force the issue. Time to use the technique that had won Damien 3 regional tournaments, and earned him recognition throughout the state martial arts circuit. "You're pretty good at running away," Damien said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "But let's see how you handle some real offense." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, that Damien was about to escalate beyond the friendly spar they'd agreed to. Damien took a deep breath, centered himself, and launched into his signature combination. It started with a series of rapid-fire punches designed to overwhelm his opponent's defenses, followed immediately by his specialty, a spinning heel kick that had caught countless opponents off guard over the years. The move required perfect timing and positioning, but when executed correctly, it was devastating. More importantly, it was flashy enough to remind everyone watching who the real martial artist was in this match. He committed fully to the combination, putting real power behind his strikes for the first time in the match. This wasn't play fighting anymore, this was a demonstration of serious technique. Marcus evaded the first 3 punches with his usual minimal movements, but Damien had expected that. The punches were just set up, designed to position Marcus exactly where Damien needed him for the spinning kick. As Damien planted his left foot and began the rotation for his finishing move, he felt a surge of satisfaction. Perfect position, perfect timing, perfect execution. There was no way Marcus could avoid this one. He was committed to his defensive position, with nowhere to move. But as Damien spun, bringing his heel around in a perfect arc toward Marcus's ribs, something impossible happened. Marcus wasn't there anymore. Not only had he moved, but he moved in a way that defied everything Damien thought he knew about martial arts. Instead of backing away or trying to block, Marcus had stepped forward and slightly to the side, moving into the attack rather than away from it. It was the one direction that should have been impossible, the one angle that no fighter in their right mind would ever choose. But somehow, it was exactly the right place to be. As Damien completed his spin, off balance and vulnerable, he felt Marcus's hand catch his ankle, not grabbing it, but redirecting its momentum with surgical precision. At the same time, Marcus's other hand made contact with Damien's shoulder, a gentle touch that somehow became an irresistible force. Time seemed to slow as Damien realized what was happening. The redirection of his kick, combined with the subtle pressure on his shoulder, created a perfect storm of physics that sent him tumbling toward the mat in what felt like slow motion. But it wasn't just the takedown that left the entire dojo speechless. It was the way Marcus did it. The technique was flawless, so smooth, so effortless, that it looked more like a dance move than a fighting technique. Damien had seen variations of it before in competition footage, studied it in slow motion, tried unsuccessfully to replicate it in training. It was a legendary technique that only one fighter had ever truly mastered. They called it the ghost step. And as Damien hit the mat, looking up at Marcus with a mixture of awe and recognition, one thought blazed through his mind with crystal clarity. Holy shit. I know who you are. The name burst from his lips before he could stop it, a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent dojo. Marcus the Phantom Williams. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sound of breathing seemed to have stopped as the weight of that revelation settled over everyone present. Jaden's mouth fell open, his eyes darting between his father and Damien as if trying to process what he'd just heard. Marcus stood perfectly still, looking down at Damien with an expression that was impossible to read. For 12 years, he'd successfully buried that name, that identity, that life. And now, in the space of one perfectly executed technique, it had all come flooding back. The ghost step had given him away. The move that had made him famous, that had defined his career, that had been his signature. It was as unique as a fingerprint, and Damien had recognized it instantly. After 12 years of hiding, Marcus, the Phantom, Williams had just been exposed in front of his son, his co-workers, and a room full of witnesses. And there was no taking it back. The silence stretched on, heavy and profound, as if the entire dojo had collectively held its breath. Marcus stood motionless above Damien, his face a mask of calm that betrayed nothing of the storm that had to be raging inside him. But those who knew what to look for could see the subtle signs, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had unconsciously shifted into a more defensive position, the careful stillness that marked a man who had just watched his carefully constructed world collapse in a single moment. Damien slowly pushed himself up from the mat, never taking his eyes off Marcus. His expression was a mixture of awe, disbelief, and something approaching reverence. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the absolute silence. I watched your fights on YouTube when I was a teenager, he said, the words tumbling out as if he couldn't quite believe he was saying them. The championship bout against Rodriguez in 2011. The comeback fight against Chin where you were down on all the scorecards until the third round. The ghost step was your signature move, but nobody could figure out how you did it. Frame-by-frame analysis, slow-motion replays, nothing could break down the mechanics of it. Marcus remained silent, but something flickered in his eyes. A recognition of battles fought long ago, victories that had once meant everything and now felt like stories from someone else's life. You disappeared after the Chin fight. Damien continued, getting to his feet with careful, deliberate movements. Middle of your prime, ranked number 2 in the world, and you just vanished. Nobody knew what happened to Marcus the Phantom Williams. There were rumors, injury, personal problems, some kind of scandal, but you never gave interviews, never explained. From his position on the bench, Jaden looked like he was trying to solve the most complex puzzle of his young life. His father, his quiet, hard-working, fix-everything father, was apparently some kind of legend. The disconnect between the man who helped him with homework and reminded him to brush his teeth, and this phantom person everyone seemed to know about, was too vast to bridge immediately. Dad? Jaden's voice was small, confused, and it cut through the tension like a knife. Marcus turned toward his son, and for the first time since the match began, his carefully maintained composure cracked. The mask of calm slipped, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. He looked at Jaden with an expression that was equal parts love and regret, as if he was seeing his son for the first time and mourning something that could never be recovered. "It's complicated, Jay," Marcus said finally, his voice rough with emotion. But Damien wasn't finished. Still processing the magnitude of what he just witnessed, he slowly moved into a formal bow, not the casual acknowledgement that students gave each other, but the deep, respectful bow reserved for masters, for legends, for fighters who had earned a place in the sport's history. "I'm honored," Damien said, straightening up. "Truly honored. I never thought I'd have the chance to spar with someone of your caliber." The gesture seemed to break whatever spell had held the rest of the dojo in silence. One by one, other students began to bow as well. Kyle, the brown belt who had loaned Marcus his GI. Sarah, the teenager who had watched the entire exchange with growing amazement. Even little Tommy, though he clearly didn't understand what was happening, followed the lead of the older students. Sensei William stepped forward, his weathered face showing a mixture of respect and understanding. "I wondered," he said quietly. "Something about the way you moved, the way you observe our classes. You can't completely hide that kind of training." Marcus nodded slightly, acknowledging the older man's perceptiveness. But his attention kept returning to Jaden, who was still processing this revelation about his father's hidden past. "The night shift," Jaden said suddenly, pieces clicking together in his young mind. "That's why you took the night shift. So you could be home when I got back from school." "Among other reasons," Marcus admitted. "And the trophies in your closet. The ones you said were from when you were younger. Those were from when you were the Phantom." Marcus felt something break open in his chest. All the careful deflections, all the half-truths he'd used to protect his son from a past that felt too complicated to explain. It was all crumbling down. "Yeah," he said simply. "Those were from when I was the Phantom." Without warning, Jaden launched himself from the bench and wrapped his arms around his father's waist in a fierce hug. The embrace was tight, desperate, and filled with 10 years' worth of questions that were finally getting answers. "You're amazing," Jaden whispered into Marcus's chest. "I can't believe my dad is amazing." Marcus felt tears threaten for the first time in years. "I'm still just your dad, Jay. That's all I've ever wanted to be. But you're also the Phantom," Jaden said, pulling back to look up at his father with eyes that held new understanding. "You're both." Marcus looked around the dojo, at Damien, who was still processing the honor of having sparred with a legend, at Sensei Williams, who nodded with quiet respect, at the students who would probably spend years talking about this night, at his son, who was looking at him with a mixture of pride and wonder that he'd never seen before. For 12 years, he'd successfully hidden from this world, from this identity, from the complications that came with being someone other than just Marcus Williams, single dad and night janitor. But standing here now, surrounded by the quiet respect of fellow martial artists, holding his son who finally understood a piece of his father's history, Marcus realized something had fundamentally shifted. He couldn't go back to being invisible. The secret was out, and there was no putting it back. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing. Without another word, Marcus gently extracted himself from Jaden's embrace, picked up his cleaning supplies, and began his nightly routine. The conversation would continue at home, the questions would be answered, and the future would have to be navigated one day at a time. But for now, there was still work to do. As he pushed his mop across the training mats, Marcus felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes following his every movement. But this time, he wasn't the invisible janitor that nobody noticed. This time, they were watching Marcus, the Phantom, Williams. And somehow, that felt exactly right.